Well, I want to take a look at the broad themes of the last part of the course, part 4, after moral philosophy. We started this course um, with a section called Before Moral Philosophy. The idea was that these texts that we looked at from the Bible, although they were moral and ethical texts, they were not philosophical texts. So they couldn't be said to be moral philosophy. And moral philosophy, I would say, doesn't really begin uh, until people begin to think about what morality is. They begin to reflect on the nature of morality itself rather than making moral pronouncements, which is more or less what Jesus does, what God does, Jehovah does with the Ten Commandments, making moral pronouncements without giving some account of what morality is or what some self-reflective approach to the thing. And that really begins for us, at least, if not in history, at least in terms of this class, with the second part of the course, reading Plato and Aristotle, who had a certain approach to moral philosophy. And they were doing moral philosophy in something different from what we saw in the Bible. Again, that was moral instruction. That was giving advice or commands of a moral nature, but it wasn't a reflection upon the nature of morality itself. That really begins, at least for us, I don't know, but historically, when did moral philosophy really begin and where? I don't know, but certainly the Greeks did it 2,500 years ago, and Plato and Aristotle were doing it. And as we saw, they had a certain approach. Looking in the Platonic approach was, very open-ended, asking what is virtue, and then assuming we know nothing about it and just looking into it. Whereas, obviously, Aristotle, looking into the nature of virtue, has a much less radical approach insofar as he accepts certain truths about virtue, certain characteristics of it, and explores them. And then in part 3 of the course, Modern Moral Philosophy, we saw that the general approach of thinkers like Kant and Mill was to, in a self-conscious way, to provide a foundation for moral choice. That is, either in something like the categorical imperatives or in the greatest happiness principle, to provide some sort of absolute, in the case of Kant at least, foundation or floor, you might say, provide a criterion for moral choice, for making moral judgments. That would be a secure and objective foundation. Well, actually, in Mill, it's not so objective as it turns out. In any case, having gone through these different sort of phases, I would say, of before moral philosophy and then different approaches to moral philosophy, the last part of the course is called After Moral Philosophy. And in one way or another, the thinkers that we'll be looking at, Ruth Benedict, Ludwig Wittgenstein, A.J. Ayer, and Jean-Paul Sartre, for different reasons, perhaps. In the case of Wittgenstein and Ayer, maybe related reasons, but for very different reasons, considering the array of things we'll read in the last part of the course, but all sort of tending to the same conclusion, is that you can't do moral philosophy. I mean, you can't really do it. You can think you're doing philosophy, or you can think that you're making some kind of headway in terms of setting out the foundations, let's say, of morality, but it's not something that you can actually turn out to do. Certainly, Wittgenstein, in his lecture on ethics, is quite concerned with doing that. Certainly, the emotivist theory of morality that Ayer sets out in Language, Truth, and Logic is an attempt to do that. Whereas Benedict, I think the implication is for her there that you can't do it. And certainly Sartre tries to completely reimagine what it means to make a moral choice, or on what basis we could possibly make a moral choice. There's basically no basis at all. Each one of these pieces, in one way or another, says there are no foundations. So you can understand morality, let's say, as a human behavior, but you could never actually put the foundations to the kind of thing that, say, Kant was doing, or even Mill, to provide an absolute trustworthy foundation for moral choice. It turns out you can't do it. For Benedict, who is a cultural relativist, you can't do it because human beings there's too much variety. terms of what they thought was good and normal. Wittgenstein, because value statements don't actually have any real sense. They're nonsense because they don't actually describe states of reality. Air is something similar, that are what we think are moral statements are really just expressions of our own emotional states. And Sartre, that there are no objective values. All there are acts of freedom in terms of human action. There are not, strictly speaking, good and bad human actions. There are free and unfree human actions. So all of these things at the end, all of these basically 20th century, you might say, dismissals of moral philosophy all do just that. That on different grounds, they say that the traditional way that people have done moral philosophy, people like Aristotle and Kant and Mill, that for one reason or another, it turns out to be not something that makes any sense, which is interesting. I thought it would be an interesting way to end the course, and maybe to give you a sense of what at least one path of discussion in the 20th century was in terms of what the nature of moral philosophy actually is. Not the only one. There are certainly any number of philosophers in the 20th century who think morality is real and you can do moral philosophy, but these aren't them.